Now let's move from the Northwest to the American Southwest, which we've already talked about California and Texas, so we will leave those and we will look at the other areas. Here is the American Southwest circa 1800, when it was part of New Spain. This is shortly before Spain transferred Louisiana back to France, so Louisiana was part of it. But you've got the government of New Mexico right there west of Texas. Now, during that time in New Mexico, there were about 9 or 10,000 Pueblo Indians and about 19,000 non-Indians living in the area. So Mexican settlers and officials and so forth. Two out of outnumbering the Pueblos 2-1. Now, there were other people living in the area, the Apaches and Navajos in particular, and the Comanches operated in that area to the eastern part of it, but they were not citizens of New Mexico, and so we're not going to count them. But the people who were under Mexican jurisdiction, or I'm sorry, Spanish jurisdiction, they had been interacting, those Pueblo Indians, with the Spanish for, at this point, almost 250 years. They were very well adapted. They had, spoke Spanish for the most part. They still lived communally in the traditional way in the Pueblos, but they had adopted large portions of Spanish/Mexican culture as well. But then, in 1821, when officially the Republic of Mexico achieved its independence, this area became, instead of part of New Spain, part of Mexico. This is 1824. You can see that New Mexico, Nuevo Mexico, significantly bigger under the rule of Mexico. It had expanded quite a bit. Now, with the Mexicans in charge, there were fewer troops stationed in the area. There was less money to be spent, right? Because New Spain was part of a declining but still existing Spanish Empire. Now they're kind of on their own. So less money to provide for troops, less money to provide for other things, including the maintenance of forts and so forth. And as a result, the raids against the Pueblo Indians from the Apaches, Navajos, and Comanches greatly increased. Another issue was that in addition to less money, they also had less autonomy in Nuevo Mexico. And we're talking about the Mexicans living there and the Pueblos who were living there. The administrators, the city administrators, town administrators, were sent from Mexico City instead of being chosen from among the people who lived there, which is what had been done under New Spain. On the other hand, under Mexican rule, all Indians were made full citizens, including the Pueblos, who had been very much second class under the rule of New Spain. But then on the other hand, traditional ways of living that they had sustained were less sustainable and were also frowned upon. And there was the issue of taxes. The provinces of New Spain had paid local taxes, but had never paid taxes to the national government before. Now they're having to pay taxes to the national government. That's because the national government doesn't have much money. They need to get some somewhere. Okay, another factor that arose here was the establishment in 1821 of the Santa Fe Trail. Santa Fe, Nuevo Mexico, Santa Fe, New Mexico. This trail was established from Independence, Missouri to Santa Fe, which connected New Mexico trade-wise with the United States. Now, there was another big road, important road, the El Camino Real, the Royal Road, that went south from Santa Fe down to Mexico City. So with this trade route, it actually made Santa Fe the middleman between the United States and greater Mexico in general. Now, the trail was established and worked primarily by American fur traders, mountain men. And as this trade is opened up, it's bringing not only furs and so forth, but it's also bringing more manufactured goods from the United States into New Mexico. At the same time, there's goods from farther south in Mexico now making their way to the U.S. So this was a very lucrative, very profitable trail, and Santa Fe was a bustling and very important financial center in the American Southwest. Many of the local people in and around Santa Fe, many of them of mixed Mexican and Pueblo Indian descent, started opening up a second level of trade. These manufactured goods that were coming in, some enterprising New Mexico citizens started to get in contact with the Comanches and started trading with the Comanches. And in return, the Comanches were bringing them things like livestock, for instance, and various other things which, in many cases, were being gathered from the far-flung parts of the Comancheria, the Comanche trade empire, and some of it was stuff that had been obtained from other Mexican citizens in raids. These individuals who traded with the Comanches, like I said, they became known as Comancheros. Well, in 1837, there was a revolt of the local people in Pueblo and the Pueblo Indians who allied with them against the newly appointed governor of the territory sent by the Mexican president Santa Anna, who had just been elected in 1836, if you'll recall. Our discussions about Texas, Santa Anna was not a real popular guy, and several regions rose up in rebellion against him. Well, Santa Anna increased the taxes that people were having to pay in New Mexico, and they already were kind of they were feeling kind of salty about the fact that they were having to pay national taxes at all, which they'd never done. Now it's increased. The alcalde of Santa Cruz, alcalde essentially being a mayor, he refused to collect the taxes that he was supposed to collect to send to the national government, and he was arrested. Several Pueblo Indians stormed the jail and freed him. The Mexican government viewed this as rebellion, and the new Mexican governor Perez, Alboni Perez, who was extremely unpopular right off the bat, in large part because he was not from that area. He had been sent there from Mexico City. He led a force against them to suppress that rebellion, and it didn't exactly work out the way he intended, because he lost, got captured, and had his head cut off. The rebels, which was a mixed force of local Mexicans and Pueblo Indians, declared a provisional government, their own government, and appointed their own governor, a Pueblo, named Jose Gonzalez. There was another big battle, this time a larger Mexican force. This time the Pueblos and the other rebels lost, and their leaders were executed. So the rebellion is put down, but the Mexican government made no further attempt to collect taxes from them. So that's how things were there for a few years. Then in 1846, the U.S.-Mexican War began, and we've talked about that already when we talked about Manifest Destiny. So just to skip specifically to the part about New Mexico here. 1847, New Mexico territory was occupied by the U.S., and then within a year it was going to be officially part of the United States because of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So it's made into an American territory, and the territorial governor, a guy named Charles Bent. Now, the Americans had promised that they're going to do a better job than the Mexican government had done in protecting the Pueblo Indians from the Navajos and Apaches. However, unlike Mexico or Spain, the U.S. refused to guarantee the property of the Pueblo Indians. Also, Charles Bent was remarkably prejudiced against Indians and Mexicans. So it may have been an unfortunate decision to put him in charge of them. To Americans, all Indians were alike. So if some Indians are fighting other Indians, who cares, essentially, was the approach that they took. Pueblo Indians cared very much, and remember now they had been in this area for hundreds of years and had for the most part, been cooperative. But they're not real happy about Charles Bent and this new American government. So a conspiracy is woven involving, as before, Mexicans and Pueblo Indians in Taos, which was where the new territorial government was centered. The Pueblo rebels basically stormed the governor's house, that's Charles Bent, and killed him and several of his associates. They killed Bent in front of his wife and children, scalped him alive first, and then killed him. At which point, Taos was besieged by the U.S. Army, and the Pueblo rebels made a last stand in an adobe church, not too different from the story of the Alamo, except kind of in reverse. In fact, it was almost the same number of people involved. There were a few smaller battles as well, including in Las Vegas. And when all was said and done, several Pueblo Indians and Mexicans were executed for treason, which is I suppose technically true, but also in a way not true, because treason is when you betray your own government, and they were being occupied by a foreign government. Anyway, after that point, there was little further resistance in the area to the American forces, but that was how American rule over New Mexico started out. That was the foot that they started on. So, taking a broader look at the different areas of the West into which Americans have been extending in the first half of the 19th century, we have looked in turn at Texas, California, the Pacific Northwest, and the Southwest. 4 regions, all with one thing in common: a new power to have to contend with: American settlers and the American government. Americans, both citizen and politician and military, tended to view Indians in these regions not as potential partners or as allies, and certainly not as citizens, which is how the government of Mexico had treated them, but as a barrier standing in the way of further expansion. So the way things got started off in all these regions was a portent of things to come. All right, well, at this point, we are going to make a little bit of a pivot, and we're going to pick up on the thread of the political narrative post Mexican U.S. war as to the official federal government response to American expansion westward.